While I was away on a business trip, my parents sold my dream sports car to pay for my sister's luxurious vacation to London. When I came back, my mother smiled and said, "Thanks to your car, our daughter is having the best time of her life." I just burst out laughing. Annoyed, she blurted out, "What's so funny?" That's when I told her the truth. The moment she realized what they had actually sold, her face turned pale. To tell you the full story, please subscribe to the channel. I was exhausted when I got home. The kind of exhaustion that seeps into your bones after back-to-back meetings, airport delays, and barely any sleep. But I had one thing to look forward to: my car. That car wasn't just a machine, it was my reward. Every late night, every overtime shift, every sacrifice I made, it all led to that moment when I bought it. The sleek body, the way the engine roared to life, the feeling of freedom every time I pressed the gas. But as I walked into the driveway, I froze. It wasn't there. At first, I thought maybe I had parked it somewhere else. My mind was foggy from the flight, so I checked the garage. Empty. Checked the street. Nothing. A strange, uneasy feeling settled in my chest. I stepped inside, dragging my suitcase behind me. My mom was in the kitchen, leaning back in her chair, sipping tea with that usual self-satisfied smirk. "Oh, you're back," she said casually, barely looking up. "Yeah, where's my car?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She placed her cup down, tilting her head like I had just asked something ridiculous. Then, with a little chuckle, she said, "Oh, that? We sold it. Thanks to your car, our daughter is enjoying her trip to London." I blinked. I must have misheard her. "You... what?" My voice came out weird, hollow. She smiled like she had done me a favor. For a moment, I just stood there, numb. My mind refused to process what I had just heard. They sold my car. Not a scratch, not a dent, not even a single warning. Just gone. My heartbeat slammed against my ribs, my breath shallow. That car wasn't just some expensive toy. It was my blood, sweat, and sacrifices rolled into one. Every late night shift, every time I skipped out on vacations, every time I chose work over a social life, it had all been for that car, my car, and they just took it. No call, no text, no permission. They didn't even think to ask because, in their minds, my hard work never belonged to me. It belonged to them. I clenched my jaw, my fingers curling into fists. My mother sipped her tea like this was just another casual afternoon conversation, like she hadn't just ripped away something that meant everything to me. All for my sister. Of course, it was always for her. The golden child, the princess, the one who never lifted a damn finger but always got handed the best of everything. And now she was off in London, probably posting selfies at some fancy restaurant, enjoying a trip that was paid for by stealing from me. A bitter taste rose in my throat. Anger, betrayal, disbelief, all of it swirled together until I felt like I might explode. I wanted to scream. I wanted to make them feel the way they just made me feel. But instead, I laughed. And that was the moment my mother's smirk began to disappear. I don't know what came over me. I should have been screaming, demanding answers, breaking something, anything, to make them understand what they had done. But instead, I laughed. It wasn't forced. It wasn't fake. It just bubbled up out of me, cold and sharp, like ice cracking under pressure. A sound that didn't match the situation at all. My mother's smirk twitched. Her fingers gripped her teacup a little tighter, but she kept her voice light. "Why are you laughing?" she asked, like I was the one acting crazy. That only made me laugh harder. It wasn't amusement. It was disbelief, exhaustion, a bitter sense of irony that this was what I came home to after months of working my ass off. I had sacrificed so much. And for what? To be robbed by my own parents? I wiped at my eyes, my laughter fading into something hollow. My father, who had been silent this whole time, cleared his throat and shifted in his seat. He was uncomfortable now, suddenly aware that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't going to end the way they expected. Good. I took a deep breath, my fingers drumming against the counter as I looked at them. You sold my car, I said, finally voicing it out loud. The words felt foreign, like they didn't belong in reality. My mother rolled her eyes. Oh, don't be so dramatic. We did it for family. Your sister deserved this trip. She's never had an opportunity like this. I let that sink in. She deserved it. And I didn't? I had worked tirelessly for years to afford that car, and in their eyes, it was nothing compared to my sister's luxury vacation. My father exhaled through his nose like he was already bored of this conversation. It was just a car, Avery. Don't overreact. Just a car. They had no idea. No idea what they had really done. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. My mother shifted uncomfortably now, glancing at my father as if to ask, why isn't she yelling? Why isn't she reacting the way we expected? I leaned back, crossing my arms, my voice steady. All right, I said, my lips curling into a small smile. You sold my car. Let's talk about that. And just like that, their confidence started to crack. I watched them, both sitting there, so damn pleased with themselves. They really thought they had won, that I would just get over it, that I'd let them brush this under the rug like all the other times they had taken from me. I took a slow breath, then leaned forward, resting my elbows on the counter. You sold my car, I repeated, letting the words settle in the air. My mother let out a dramatic sigh, already impatient. Yes, Avery, we've established that. It's done. No point dwelling on it. I tilted my head slightly. Interesting. My father folded his arms. What's interesting? I met his eyes, my voice calm. That you actually think you had the right to sell it. The smugness on my mother's face twitched. Oh, don't start this. I ignored her. See, the car wasn't just mine. I let that sink in for a second before continuing. It was co-owned with someone else. Silence. My father's arm slowly lowered. My mother's lips parted, just slightly. I tapped my fingers on the counter. And here's the real problem. You selling it? That wasn't just selfish. That was illegal. The color in my mother's face drained just a little. What do you mean, illegal? She scoffed, but I could hear the slight waver in her voice. I smiled, slow and deliberate. I mean, the car was part of a contractual agreement. I co-owned it with an investor who put up half the money. We had a binding contract that required both of our signatures to sell. So, legally, you had no right to touch it. The room was dead silent now. My father shifted uncomfortably, his fingers pressing into the edge of the table. That, that can't be right, he muttered. Oh, but it is, I said, shrugging. And the guy I co-own it with, he's not just some casual investor. He's serious about his assets. And now, because of what you did, he's going to be furious. My mother swallowed hard. Avery, let's not blow this out of proportion. I let out a breathless chuckle. Oh, trust me, I don't need to. He'll handle that himself. I leaned in slightly. Because now, your little sale, that's called fraud. And fraud, that comes with legal consequences. My father's jaw tightened. My mother clutched her teacup like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. And here's the best part, I added, my tone almost cheerful. Because you went ahead and sold something that wasn't legally yours, you're on the hook for every single cent. Their faces were priceless, eyes wide, mouths slightly open, the realization sinking in like lead. I sat back and exhaled, letting the weight of my words settle in. So, I said, tilting my head. Tell me again how this was just a car? And for the first time, they had nothing to say. Silence. For the first time in my life, they had nothing to say. No excuses, no condescending remarks, no dismissive waves of the hand. Just silence. My mother was the first to react. Her smirk had completely vanished, replaced with something I had never seen on her before: fear. She gripped the teacup so hard I thought it might shatter. My father, on the other hand, had gone rigid. He ran a hand through his thinning hair and let out a sharp exhale. Then he stood up and started pacing. Oh, this was beautiful. I leaned back, crossing my arms, watching them with mild amusement. Funny how quickly their confidence crumbled when they realized there were actual consequences. This can't be that serious, my mother finally said, though her voice lacked its usual arrogance. I mean, you're making it sound worse than it is. I raised an eyebrow. Am I? I tilted my head. Because last time I checked, selling something that isn't yours, especially something worth 6 figures, is fraud. And fraud? Well, let's just say my investor doesn't take that lightly. My father stopped pacing and turned to me, his face tight. What exactly does that mean? I shrugged. Could be fines, could be a lawsuit, maybe even criminal charges. Depends on how pissed off he is. I let that hang in the air for a second. And trust me, he's going to be pissed. My mother's face drained of color. She looked at my father, waiting for him to say something, fix this somehow. But for once, he looked just as lost as she did. Who is this investor? My father finally asked. I smiled, slow and deliberate. Let's just say he's someone who doesn't like people messing with his money. That made my mother physically flinch. My father swallowed hard. Maybe we can call the buyer, get the car back. I let out a laugh. Oh, sure. I'm sure they'll just hand it over out of the kindness of their heart, especially if they already resold it for a higher price. My mother shot up from her chair. You need to call your investor and explain that this was just a mistake. A mistake. I let the word sink in. They stole from me. They sold my dream, my hard work, without a second thought. And now, when reality was crashing down on them, they wanted me to fix it? I stood up slowly, locking eyes with my mother. You didn't ask me before selling it, I said, my voice calm but sharp as a knife. Why should I help you now? Her mouth opened, but no words came out. My father's pacing grew frantic. I could practically see the calculations running through his head, the realization that this mess was all on them. I turned and started walking toward the door. Where are you going? My mother called after me, desperation creeping into her voice. I didn't even look back. To make a call. And just like that, they finally understood what panic felt like. I stepped out onto the porch, letting the cool evening air calm the fire raging inside me. I pulled out my phone, scrolled through my contacts, and pressed call. It rang once, twice. Then a sharp voice answered, Avery, what's up? I took a slow breath. We have a problem. Silence. Then his tone dropped. What kind of problem? I gripped the phone tighter. My parents sold the car. A beat of silence, then, they what? His voice was no longer casual. It was sharp, dangerous. They sold it, without my permission, without your permission, I said, choosing my words carefully. And from what I gathered, it's already been resold. It's gone. The silence that followed was deafening. Then he spoke, slow and deliberate. Do they have any idea what they've done? Oh, they're starting to figure it out, I said, glancing back through the window. My mother was wringing her hands, my father still pacing like a caged animal. His sigh came through the receiver, but there was no amusement in it. That car wasn't just an investment for me. That was a rare, limited edition collector's model. Do you know how many people were waiting to get their hands on it? I did. That's why I partnered with him in the first place. I know, I said, and I know this isn't just about the money. His voice was steel. No, it isn't. But now it will be. I already knew what was coming. I want full compensation, he said, his voice icy. Not just for the car, but for the loss of investment. I expect nothing less than double what it was worth. Double. I glanced back through the window again. My parents were still watching me, their expressions full of desperate hope. Hope that I'd somehow clean up their mess. I wasn't going to. Send me the amount, I said. I'll make sure they get the message. He didn't hesitate. Good. And Avery? Yeah? If they don't pay up, I'll take legal action. This wasn't just theft, it was fraud, and I have no problem taking them to court. I smirked. I know, that's why I called you. A pause, then a low chuckle. I always liked you, Mitchell. You don't play games. Never have, never will. We ended the call and I turned back inside, slipping my phone into my pocket. My parents were staring at me, waiting. I exhaled, then gave them the final blow. He wants double what the car was worth. And if you don't pay up, he's taking you to court. My mother's face turned ashen. My father stumbled back into his chair, rubbing his temples like that would somehow make this nightmare disappear. You thought you could get away with it, I said, shaking my head. Now, you're screwed. My parents looked like they had been hit by a truck. My mother sat frozen, her knuckles white as she clutched the edge of the table. My father rubbed his face, exhaling sharply, as if hoping this was just a bad dream he could wake up from. But it wasn't. It was real, and it was their mess. So, my father said, clearing his throat, maybe we can call the buyer, offer to buy it back. I almost laughed, almost. Oh, you think they'll just give it back out of the goodness of their heart? I shook my head. Newsflash, people don't buy rare collectors' cars just to return them, especially at a loss. My mother shot me a sharp look. There has to be a way. There is, I said, smirking. You pay them more than they bought it for. She flinched. More? Yep, I said, leaning back against the counter. I called the buyer already just out of curiosity. You know what they said? That they loved their new purchase, but they'd consider selling it back for double the price. My father's eyes widened. Double? I nodded. Oh yeah, because, the car was already rare, but now it's been confirmed as a hot commodity. They said, and I quote, if someone wants it back that badly, it must be worth even more than I thought. My mother's face drained of color. We don't have that kind of money, she whispered. Yeah, I said, feigning sympathy. That's a real shame. The silence between us stretched, thick with tension. My father looked at me then, his expression carefully controlled. Avery, we need your help. There it was, the plea. I tilted my head. Oh? My help? My mother forced a tight smile. You know we wouldn't have done this if we didn't have to. We were just thinking about the family. About your sister. At the mention of my sister, something inside me snapped. I straightened, my voice calm but sharp as glass. Oh, you mean the sister who's off in London, living her best life, completely clueless that her luxury trip was funded by stealing from me? My mother's mouth opened, but I wasn't done. You didn't ask me before taking my car, I said, my voice cold. So why should I help you now? My father clenched his jaw. Because we're your parents. I let out a humorless chuckle. Oh, now I'm your child. When I was busting my ass to afford that car, I was just an afterthought. But now that you need money, now I'm your kid again? Neither of them had a response. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door. You two can figure this out on your own. Avery, please. I didn't even turn around. Enjoy explaining this to my sister when she gets back. And with that, I walked out, leaving them to drown in their own mess. The days that followed were glorious. For the first time in my life, I didn't have to carry the weight of my parents' selfish decisions. I didn't have to be the one fixing their mistakes, bending over backward to keep the peace. No, this time, they were on their own, and it was eating them alive. I heard through some mutual contacts, because, of course, they were too proud to tell me themselves, that they were scrambling, desperate. They had tried everything, calling the buyer, begging for a discount, even reaching out to my investor to try and negotiate. None of it worked. The buyer refused to return the car unless they made it worth their while, which meant paying far more than they had sold it for. My investor? He wasn't interested in sob stories. He wanted his money in full, or he was ready to drag them through a very public, very expensive legal battle. And my sister? Still in London, completely unaware that her precious vacation was being funded by the destruction of our parents' finances. It was poetic. Then came the real kicker. With no other options left, my parents had to sell their assets to come up with the money, including their beloved vacation home. That house, it was their pride and joy, their escape, the place they had poured money into for years, boasting about it to friends and family. They had taken my sister there countless times for lavish getaways. Me? I had been invited maybe twice, and only because they needed someone to take their pictures. And now? Gone. Sold off to fix a mess they created. When I found out, I didn't feel sorry for them. Not one bit. I felt free. For the first time, I wasn't the one suffering for their decisions. I wasn't the one losing something I loved. They were, and that was the price of their greed, their entitlement, their complete disregard for me. I wasn't their backup plan anymore. One day, my mother finally called. I almost didn't pick up, but curiosity got the best of me. Her voice was hollow. "Are you happy now?" I thought about it for a second. "Yeah," I said. "I think I am." She let out a bitter breath. "You ruined us." I laughed. Actually laughed. "I ruined you?" I repeated. "No, Mom. You did this to yourselves. Actions have consequences. You just never thought they'd apply to you." She started to say something else, but I didn't care to hear it. I ended the call, blocked her number, and tossed my phone onto the couch. This time, I wasn't looking back. I was finally completely free. Months passed, and life had never felt lighter. Without my parents' constant guilt trips, manipulations, and entitlement weighing me down, I was free. I focused on myself, my work, and finally enjoyed the peace that came with cutting off toxicity. Then, one afternoon, while scrolling through social media, I stumbled upon something that made me burst out laughing. A post from my sister. She was back from London, and she was furious. Her once perfectly curated influencer-like feed, filled with extravagant brunches, designer shopping sprees, and scenic views from five-star hotels, was now replaced with ranting. "I can't believe this. My parents went broke while I was gone. I come back and suddenly we don't have the vacation house, no more luxury trips, no more shopping money. WTF happened?" I leaned back, grinning. "Oh, sweetheart, what happened is called consequences." Comment after comment flooded in, some from her equally spoiled friends, others from people clearly enjoying the downfall. "Wait, didn't your family used to be super rich? How do parents go broke in just a few months?" LMAO, sounds like karma hit hard. I clicked on her profile and scrolled through more posts. Apparently, her life had taken quite the downward spiral. No more designer clothes, no more high-end vacations, no more treating life like an endless shopping spree funded by other people's sacrifices. She was struggling, complaining about having to budget as if that was some kind of punishment, whining about having to move into a smaller house, and, my personal favorite, furious that she had to get a job, a real, actual job. I almost felt bad. Almost. Because while she was off living it up in London, drinking overpriced cocktails and taking selfies in front of tourist attractions, she had no clue that our parents had been losing everything just to keep her comfortable. They had sold my car to fund her luxury. Then, to fix the financial disaster they created, they had to sell their assets. Now, she was left with nothing. And me? I was thriving. I took a sip of my coffee, letting the satisfaction settle in. This was better than any revenge I could have planned. Because this was justice, poetic justice. She had spent her entire life being pampered, given everything without ever having to work for it. And now, she was drowning in the real world, completely unprepared. I didn't comment on her post. I didn't need to. I just smiled, closed the app, and moved on with my day. Because, unlike her, I knew how to take care of myself. And that, in the end, made all the difference.